Hello everyone, and a warm welcome back to our Evolution and Ecology seminar series. My name is Elizabeth Duxbury, and I'm a postdoc in the research group of Alexei Maklikov at the University of East Anglia, and I'll be hosting today's session. As always, we will have a Q&A session directly after today's talks, so please post your questions in the dedicated Slack channel. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alejandro Gonzalez-Voyer from the Institute of Ecology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Alejandro is an evolutionary biologist whose research explores how phenotypes evolve and species diversify using a powerful combination of phylogenetic comparative methods across a wide variety of taxa, including neotropical amphibians, killifish, birds, mammals, and even the flowering plants. Alejandro's research is revealing the important drivers of species diversification and how both ecological adaptation and sexual selection can play a role. Alejandro's more recent work is providing fascinating insights into the evolution of brain size and its relationship to life history, behavior, urbanization, and even extinction, including an intriguing evolution paper published last year on long life and large brain sizes across bird lineages. Alejandro has pioneered the development of the novel comparative method phylogenetic path analysis as a powerful tool to tease apart cause and effect relationships in evolutionary biology. Alejandro was the recipient of a prestigious Newton Advanced Fellowship, and his research is continuing to make important contributions to evolutionary biology. Today, Alejandro will present his talk entitled Brain Size in a Changing World and its Relationship to Life History. So Alejandro, thank you for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll start by sharing the screen. And I hope you can all see the talk. So thank you, Elizabeth, and all the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful seminar series. It's really a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work. And like you said, I'm going to be talking a bit about brain size evolution. But first, I would like to start by mentioning a bit sort of what are the research questions that we address in my research group. And as Elizabeth said, we are interested in how the great diversity of phenotypes that we see across the tree of life have evolved. And we do this working mostly on in animals, so working with birds. We've done work with neotropical amphibians, fish, mammals, but we have also had the opportunity to collaborate with people that work with angiosperms, gymnosperms, and even social amoeba. We're also interested in understanding what are the factors that drive the unequal distribution of species richness, both across the branches of the tree of life, but also across the geographical area. So this is well illustrated here in the graph that you're seeing in the slide, which shows warm colors indicating regions of high species diversity and cooler colors indicating regions with low species diversity. And this represents probably the oldest ecological gradient described in the early 19th century by Alexander von Humboldt, who wrote that the nearer we approach the tropics, the greater the increase in the variety of structure, grace of form, and mixture of colors, and also in the perpetual youth and vigor of organic life, which I think describes very well the diversity and the species living in the tropics. And actually, this is how we should be writing research papers. It's a lot more poetic than what we normally do. And to address these questions, we use phylogenetic comparative methods. And using comparative analysis allows us to explore macroevolutionary patterns by looking at the broad outcome of evolutionary processes across a large number of species. By including this large number of species, we can detect repeated associations, either between traits of those species or the traits and environmental variables of interest. And also by including a large number of species, these comparative analysis encompass long periods of evolutionary change. And it is important to highlight that it is only within an explicitly phylogenetic framework that we can detect convergence in the selection forces that are influencing evolution, which I think is a very strong evidence for the action of natural selection. And before I begin the talk itself, I would like to acknowledge that this work was done with a great group of wonderful researchers whom I've also been lucky to call my friends. And I think that really, if there's a lesson to be learned, is find good collaborators that are also friends, which make the whole process a lot more agreeable. So I'm going to talk to you about brain evolution. And this has attracted interest for a long time and continues to do so. And this is just a screenshot of an article that appeared in The Guardian in late March this year. And it was highlighting a study that found a mechanism by which allowed the human brain to grow a lot larger than that of a closely related primate or the other great apes. Which highlights, I think, the great interest in brain evolution and the interest in the differences in brain size among different groups. And I would quibble a little bit with the title because it says, scientists discover why the human brain is so big. And I would say, well, yeah, scientists have discovered how the human brain is so big, but why really relates to evolutionary questions. And these are the sort of questions that have drawn lots of attention from different researchers, many colleagues, looking at to understand, well, you know, what are the factors that are driving these differences that we see in brain size? And in the graph here, you see the major vertebrate groups and the relationship body weight and brain weight. And instead of drawing dots, what is drawn are polygons joining all the members of these different major vertebrate groups. And what you see is firstly that most variation in brain size can be explained in body size, which is interesting in itself. But what has attracted most interest from researchers is understanding what are the factors that explain the differences among the major vertebrate groups in differences in brain size. For example, birds always have larger brain sizes than do reptiles, but also within the birds, we have pretty big differences in brain size, even among species of the same body size. And this is what has drawn most of the interest, to understanding why do some species have larger brains than other species. And evolutionary biologists, we normally look at these questions through looking at the balance between benefits and costs. And the costs in brain size are pretty important because the brain is very, very energetically expensive. Just as an example, in humans, the brain represents about 2% of total body mass, whereas it requires about 20% of daily energy needs. So increases in brain size have to be compensated either by an increase in energy input, so getting higher quality food, or by a decrease in the energy that is destined for other functions. And here we're talking about trade. One of the things that we want to understand is to find a broad explanation for the differences in brain size among species. And this is one of the challenges that Dante Jimenez Ortega tried to address during his MHC thesis. So his master's thesis in Mexico, they are 2 years thesis, like in the US and Canada. And but he's now working on diversification in amphibians. But for his master's, he looked at the relationship between brain size, life history, and longevity in birds. So one of the explanations that has been proposed for the evolution of brain size, which can be sort of broadly applicable across vertebrate groups, is the cognitive buffer hypothesis. So basically, the hypothesis proposes that larger brain size is favored by selection because it is associated with greater behavioral flexibility, sort of related to, for example, feeding innovation, tolerance to climatic fluctuations, or habitat disturbances. And this greater behavioral flexibility allows species to reduce their extrinsic mortality. That is by avoiding dying from starvation because of the feeding innovation or avoiding predators. And this allows selection to work on intrinsic mortality and prolonging longevity. And there is previous support for this hypothesis, as you can see on the graph on the left here with with the mammals. You can see that there's a positive relationship between brain size, even controlling for body size, and total lifespan. And as well, in the graph in the bottom right, you can see that there's also a positive relationship between brain size, controlling for body size, and lifespan in birds. However, the relationship might not be so simple, because we know that there's also a relationship between brain size and life history. For example, in birds, species with larger brains have eggs that are larger than even controlling for their body size, and clutch sizes that are smaller due to the trade-off between egg size and clutch size. Brain size is also related to development times. So species with larger brains have longer incubation periods and delayed fledgling ages. So the development of the embryos and the development post-hatching is also prolonged. And to make things even more complicated, even within bird species, we know that there's quite a bit of variation in the development mode. So on one extreme, we have altricial species, which are born with the eyes closed, no feathers or very little down, are highly dependent on parental care, and have slow development. Whereas at the other extreme, we have precocial species that are born with eyes open, with down or feathers, can feed themselves often or very quickly, and have fast development. Interestingly, these differences are also related with brain size, where altricial species tend to have larger brains than their precocial counterparts. So the aim that Dante had was to disentangle these direct and indirect possible relationships between brain size and maximum longevity. So on the one hand, we could have this direct link between brain size and maximum longevity through the effect of greater behavioral flexibility, as proposed by the cognitive buffer hypothesis. However, the correlation between brain size and maximum longevity could actually result through effects of brain size on life history traits, which in turn influence longevity. Of course, we have to take into account that the relationship could be due to solely body size effects, where a larger body mass might have a direct effect on maximum longevity through allometric effects, or an indirect effect through life history traits. So what we wanted to do is really disentangle these direct from indirect relationships. And as Elizabeth said, we had proposed with Ahatz von Hardenberg a way to do this in an explicitly phylogenetic framework using phylogenetic path analysis. And one of the co-organizers of this wonderful seminar series has actually developed a package to make this a lot easier, Wouter Vanderbilt. So using phylogenetic path analysis, what Dante tried to do was to disentangle these effects, direct from indirect effects, by comparing models within three different scenarios. So on the one hand, he proposed scenarios which were within allometry, where all effects were due to allometry. So body mass influenced brain size, and this is stable throughout all the models. So, but there's always a direct link between body mass and brain size. But body mass could have a direct effects on maximum longevity or indirect effects through life effects on life history traits. The other scenario considered only brain size effects. So brain size could have a direct link to maximum longevity, as proposed by the cognitive buffer hypothesis, or indirect effects through life history traits. Finally, of course, he had to consider a combination of both brain size and allometric effects, either through direct links or indirect links through life history traits. And the aim was to compare across all these different models to find which fit the data best. So Dante tested a total of 82 models across these three hypotheses. And he did this separately for altricial and precocial species, because as we've seen, there are differences in the relationship between brain size and body size in altricial and precocial species, and also differences in their life history traits. And the 82 models were within the allometric brain size and combined effects hypothesis. So first, he compared the fit of the different models and found that models within the combined effects scenarios fit the data much better than all the other ones. So you see the AIC differences in the boxes below, and this was the same both for altricial and precocial species. The models within the allometric effects fit the data slightly worse, and the ones that fit the data worse of all were the brain size effects, where we only considered links between brain size and all life history traits and maximum longevity. So both for precocial and altricial species, we found clear support for a direct link between brain size and maximum longevity, so in support of the cognitive buffer hypothesis. However, there were also links between brain size and life history traits, and as well as links between body mass and maximum longevity, so a direct effect and an indirect effect through the life history traits, and this both for altricial and precocial species. For the precocials, what we found was that there was a link between brain size and X size, a link between body mass and X size and clutch size, and as well a direct link between body mass and maximum longevity and between brain size and maximum longevity. And we also found a direct link between fledgling age and maximum longevity, where prolonged development at the nestling stage was associated with greater maximum longevity. For the precocial species, the picture was much more complicated. So again, we found a direct link between brain size and maximum longevity, as well as a direct link between body mass and maximum longevity. Brain size had an influence on X size, which in turn influenced maximum longevity. Body mass basically influenced all life history traits. So we found support for direct links between body size and X size, clutch size, incubation, and fledgling age. And finally, we found a direct link between clutch size and maximum longevity. So in sum, Dante's results suggest that there is support for a direct link between brain size and maximum longevity, and this is beyond any allometric effects. There is also support for an indirect link between brain size and maximum longevity through effects on reproductive investment and development time. So development time mostly on through, in the precocial species, and the altricial species. And we propose that the cognitive buffer hypothesis should be extended to include life history effects, because we find clear support for indirect effects of brain size and body size acting on these life history traits, which in turn affect longevity. And brain size and allometry have synergistic effects on maximum longevity, both directly and indirectly through life history. So it seems that this could actually be a hypothesis which could propose an explanation for differences in brain size across species, which could apply actually to all vertebrates, although it still needs to be tested in a wider diversity of species. But what about the benefits? And the benefits, particularly in a changing world of brain size. And as I've told you, we know that brain size through previous studies is associated with a higher frequency of behavioral innovation and also the use of tools across the very different species. And we also know that brain size is associated with increased success of introduced species or species invading disturbed habitats. And we also know that we're seeing very rapid changes in the landscape. So there's growing urbanization, particularly in areas such as Africa, Asia, but also in Latin America. It's slowing down apparently in Europe and maybe North America, but still we have cities that keep growing and that really, present species with quite novel challenges. So wildlife in urban areas is exposed to novel environmental pressures, which can include high vehicular and pedestrian traffic, large-scale occurrence of impervious surfaces, chemical, acoustic, and light pollution. We also know that urban areas generally present higher temperatures than the surrounding rural areas, what is known as the heat island effect. And this potentially prolongs favorable climatic conditions for species living in the cities. Also, the increased waste production, as well as the presence of introduced species, ornamental plants, or even direct feeding by humans, might actually increase food availability for some species. So this all led us to ask, well, does brain size play a role in the ability of species to adapt to these novel urban habitats? So first we looked at this with birds, and we combined a study that involved several passerine species from 22 different families. And what the researchers in this study had done was to visit the center of 12 representative cities in Central Europe. One of them was shown in the picture previously. And they visited the city centers and collected data on which species were actually nesting in those city centers, and then went to the rural surrounding areas to find species that were nesting in those rural areas, but were not found in the cities. So those nesting in the city were successful urban colonizers, and those found in the rural areas, but not nesting within the city, were urban avoiders. And we combined this information with data on brain size and body size across all the species. So what we did first was to relate relative brain size, so brain size controlling for body size, with whether species were successful or unsuccessful at invading city centers. And what we found was that successful urban colonizers had larger brains than species that avoided the cities. When we looked at the family level, we found that the average brain size for the family was larger in families where there was a higher proportion of species that were successful in invading the cities, such as Paridae, for example, compared to average brain size in families where species tended to avoid urban areas, such as Embericidae. So it seems that large brain size predisposes avian species for successful urban establishment. However, it also suggests that birds from relatively small brain size lineages may actually be exposed to greater risks as a result of urbanization. And this led us to ask, well, what happens in mammals? Because mammals are also well known to be successful at invading city centers. Those living in North America will know that the ravages that raccoons can do to your garbage if you're not careful, and that garbage dumps are often good spots to see bears. Sorry. And mammals also present high diversity in body structure and body size. For example, on the top left, you see an Etruscan shrew, which is found in cities along the Mediterranean basin and weighs only 2.5 grams. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see a leopard, which roams in cities in India and weighs up to 90 kilograms. There's also large differences in life history and ecology. For example, the house mouse roams less than 100 meters from where it lives to feed, whereas the Mexican free-tailed bat, which is also found in cities, can have foraging trips of up to 45 kilometers. And this suggested that urban habitats might have contrasting effects on the different mammalian groups, making the picture potentially more complex than in birds. So we wanted to analyze this urban invasion in mammals, and we analyzed direct and indirect effects of behavioral, ecological, and life history traits on mammalian ability to exploit urban environments. We collected data on ranging and dispersal abilities, behavioral and cognitive flexibility, diet generalism, and reproductive rates for all species. And we classified species based as urban dwellers, so those that exploit urban areas to fulfill all the needs, that is that they breed and they forage within the cities. And urban visitors are those that occur in urban areas but regularly leave the cities, either to reproduce or to feed or whatever. So The first, what is shown here are the path models that were best supported for the different groups. And what you can see is that the relationships are pretty much idiosyncratic. So there are large differences across the major groups, mammal groups, in what factors are important in for successful urban establishment. This is for urban visitors. So the blue arrows show positive relationships, whereas the red arrows show negative relationships. And you can see that, for example, traits related to reproductive rates, such as litter size, are important across all the groups. Whereas, for example, brain size is important only for primates, carnivores, and bats. Diet diversity, which is DD, was found to be important in carnivores and primates, and weaning age was found to be important in carnivores, primates, and ungulates, although the direction of the relationship was different among the groups. For urban dwelling, the picture is slightly more diverse. We also found litter size to be important across all groups, but brain size was only important for rodents, which was slightly surprising, to be honest, and for primates, whereas it was no longer important for carnivores. So what we can see is that urban areas have a filtering effect on traits that predispose species to persist in urban environments. Reproduction-related traits were important determinants of success in urban environments across all mammalian orders. And brain mass seems to play a role, but it has positive effects mostly in urban visitors and potentially might be slightly less important for urban dwellers. And high diet diversity is an important predictor of mammalian adaptation to urban environment in carnivores, primates, and rodents. But is it all good news for big brain species? If we look across the fossil record in mammals, it seems that, or the results seem to suggest that there is a certain, let's say, selection has favored to a certain extent increases in brain size. So species that we see today tend to have larger brains than their fossil ancestors. And we know that large brain size is associated with a diversity of benefits, some of which I've presented today. But we also know that large brains are associated with certain costs. Because they are energetically costly, they are related with trade-offs with life history traits. So we know from previous work, for example, a nice paper by Nick Barton and Isabella Capellini showing that there is a relationship between larger brain sizes and reduced litter sizes, longer gestation periods, delayed weaning, and later ages of first reproduction across mammals. So we were wondering, what's the balance of the benefits and the costs of brain size, especially in the face of these rapid changes that we're seeing across the landscape due to anthropogenic activities. So the first thing we did was to review the literature to find which were the traits that were more often linked to vulnerability to extinction across mammals. And we found these to be large body mass, low population density, small litter size, longer gestation, and delayed weaning. And you will recognize that three of these traits, the three last ones, are actually the ones that I already told you are related to larger brain sizes. So we were asking, does brain size influence a vulnerability to extinction? And if it does, how? You could have that larger brains, through the benefit of behavioral innovation, actually buffer species against the anthropogenic threats that we're seeing, leading to greater success, so lower vulnerability to extinction. On the other hand, larger brains could delay reproduction, resulting in higher vulnerability to extinction. As I've shown previously, that these life history traits actually influence potential population growth rates and thus higher are related to higher vulnerability to extinction. So we wanted to look at the relationships, direct and indirect, between body size, brain size, life history traits such as litter size, gestation, and weaning, abundance, which was estimated as population density, and the vulnerability to extinction, which we codified based on the IUCN Red List. So this was our conceptual framework. On the one hand, we could have body mass influencing vulnerability to extinction due to, for example, higher exploitation pressure. So we know that larger species tend to be hunted more, and this increases extrinsic mortality, leading to higher vulnerability to extinction. We know also that body mass can influence ecology and life history through allometric effects, and these traits are known to influence vulnerability to extinction, so we could have indirect effects. On the other hand, brain mass could influence vulnerability to extinction by buffering species through the beneficial effects of behavioral innovation. On the other hand, the costs of a large brain size could actually lead to a slower life history, increasing vulnerability to extinction. So we wanted to compare these different scenarios and disentangle the direct from indirect relationships. So we compared these scenarios using AIC. Wait, I think I skipped one. Here. So we proposed 36 different models within these three scenarios. So some were within the body mass allometry, some within costs and benefits of brain size, and some that combine the effects of both brain size and allometric effects. Sorry. So when we compared these scenarios using AIC, we found that the models that fit the data best were those within the allometry and brain scenario. So it's not very surprising, combining both the effects of brain size and body size. The models within the brain costs and benefits fit the data slightly worse, and those that fit the data worst of all were those that only accounted for body size effects. So this is the best model. Don't worry, I'll walk you through it. So on the left-hand side, we see the effects of body size. So body size was related with lower population densities. This is nothing novel. We'd seen this before, and it was proposed in the literature. Body size also is related with greater litter sizes, so larger animals tend to have larger litters. On the other hand, we found that brain mass was related with smaller litter size. That is, for a given body size, animals with larger brains had smaller litters, which had also been proposed in the literature. Brain size was related with longer gestation periods and delayed weaning, again, as proposed in previous studies. We found an effect of population density on vulnerability to extinction. And this is not only due to how species are categorized by the IUCN, because some of you will know that one of the factors which determines a species' vulnerability to extinction is actually population density. So even if we remove the species that were categorized solely under population density, we still see this effect. And we also found an effect of gestation length and weaning age on vulnerability to extinction. So the take-home message from this study is that brain size is a vulnerability trait and it should not be ignored. This is the effects of brain size on life history traits, which in turn influence vulnerability to extinction, take place independently of the allometric effects. And both brain and body size affect life history in a synergistic way and indirectly affect vulnerability to extinction. So I would say that the main conclusions from this talk, and I'm sorry that there's quite a bit of text here, but is that first, that the cognitive hypothesis can provide possibly an explanation for the evolution of brain size that could apply to all vertebrates, where the benefit of prolonged lifespan could compensate the costs associated with larger brains. Of course, this is assuming that this longer lifespan is also related to a higher number of reproductive events. Larger brain size is beneficial for successful invasion of urban habitats in both birds and at least some mammals. And nonetheless, the benefits of larger brain size are not sufficient to buffer species against the negative impacts of anthropogenic effects. And the associated slower life histories actually increase vulnerability to extinction. And with that, I would like to thank funding sources, everyone for listening. I think I went a bit quicker than I thought, but this leaves time for some questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. That was a really fascinating talk and quite a journey through the different aspects of your research related to brain size and its evolution. It's great to see how you presented, first of all, the relationship to lifespan, but then also vulnerability to extinction most recently. And it's great to see how this elegant methods of the path analysis can tease apart both direct and indirect effects, and the kind of whether the effects are acting through life history traits or directly. So it's really cool. And I think these techniques will be very useful for other contexts as well, to try and tease apart exactly the relationships between different traits. So that's fascinating. Thank you. So yeah, we have a question from our audience which has already come in, so I'll move on to that one first. So what do we know about the effect of brain size on diversification and extinction rates estimated from phylogenies?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. I think there's a paper that recently came out by some members of the group of Daniel Sol that were looking at diversification rate and brain size. And if I remember correctly, because it's been a little while since I read it, but if I remember correctly, I think there was a positive relationship between, I think, speciation and brain size. But well, yeah, I wouldn't want to jump too much into it. But I think that's as far as I know, that's only been looked at in birds, if I remember correctly.
Great, thank you. That's interesting. Do you have any plans at all to look at invertebrates and the possible consequences of urbanization, the interaction with brain size, or their proxy of brain size and their vulnerability to extinction? I was just curious.
Across all vertebrates, you mean?
Invertebrates, so insects,
okay.
For example.
Yeah. No, yeah. That would be very interesting, because there are very nice works by his name is the researcher's name just escaped my mind. Sorry, but there are nice works showing differences in cognitive ability across different invertebrates, and that are related with brain size. So there are very nice works showing how bees are actually able to learn, pulling different strings to get a reward and so on. And it's very interesting because the urban habitats also present sort of novel challenges for invertebrates due to actually the use of very many introduced plant species, which actually compete with native species, for pollinators and space and resources and so on. So yeah, it would be interesting. I hadn't thought of it, but yeah, it could be interesting.
Yeah, it got me thinking, because obviously there's been a lot recently about the rapid decline in insects. And obviously it would be interesting to look at how that interacts with urbanization, but also the interplay with brain size. And so I guess using some of the methods you present could be quite an interesting angle potentially. Great.
And there's lots of interest now in also using, with all these problems with pollination services, they're actually moving towards using bred pollinators. So having breeding bees or bumblebees to actually do the pollination work. But that involves a lot of interesting potential trade-offs as well, because those animals are bred to reproduce quite rapidly. So yeah, there can be some interesting things to look at there as well.
Definitely. That's great. So we have a question which asks, do you think large-brained animals are more motivated to enter urban environments to find food because their brains require more energy?
I hadn't thought of it that way, but the way I see it more is that the cities are actually a filter. So I'm not so sure that it might be motivation, but rather that that the large brain species are able to repeatedly, sort of visit the cities, at the start at least, because they're able to exploit the resources that are found there due to their greater behavioral flexibility. So the combination of diet diversity, which was found to be important in many groups, and the brain size probably allows species that are successful in invading urban habitats to actually do so, because they can exploit the resources that are found there.
I see, that's interesting. So in some ways, the filter is filtering out which species can basically survive in the urban environments.
Yeah.
I was quite curious. So the last part of your talk, when you were looking at also the effect of population density on extinction vulnerability, it was quite interesting to find that I think you showed a negative relationship. So as population density increases, the vulnerability to extinction decreases. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's curious actually to see that.
Well, actually, if you see that, so extinction is actually population size 0, right? So the larger the population size, so it's not exactly the same, but it's sort of a proxy we're using, population density. So the higher the population density, so the larger number of animals per area that you have, then that allows populations to actually be buffered against, habitat disturbance, et cetera, that would increase extrinsic mortality because there's more of them. And that allows the population to kind of grow again and recover from that disturbance. If you have low population densities, then the mortality actually has a more important effect on that population because it puts it closer to that population size 0.
Ah, I see. That's interesting.
And you raise that. So this wasn't planned, but actually in one of the models that we had compared there was a potential link between brain size and population density, which we didn't explore further in that paper. But recently, a paper came out where we actually looked more into that relationship. And so we wonder, wow, what might be happening there? Why do you have this link between population density and brain size in mammals? And we thought, well, it could be simply because, there could be higher energetic demands of brain size, which actually has an effect on the carrying capacity of a given area, because of these energetic demands. And Isabella Capellini actually suggested, wow, you should also think that there might be sort of like potential sort of brain size effects acting on the ability of species to live in social groups and so on, which could affect population densities. And we looked at it further, and we found that there is support for a link between brain size and population densities. We don't know exactly due to what, but bigger brain species do tend to have lower population densities. And this is beyond sort of any body size effects.
Ah, that's really interesting. I guess it would be interesting to think how that links in with behavioral flexibility.
Yeah. And whether it's just solely sort of a cost, or is it, linked to other effects as well?
Yeah, definitely. And when you study the urban environments, do you distinguish between different types of urban environments and the factors involved, or is it more the urban environments in general?
It's the urban environment in general, but it's a good question because obviously, invading Mexico City is certainly much different than invading, a city in central France or in Switzerland or so on, that have, a lot more green areas and are more thought to be more friendly to the human species the human animals that live there, but also the neighbors as well, no? So other animals. So yeah, it would be interesting to see whether the challenges are slightly different across different size cities and what effects that has, but we haven't looked into that yet. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So there's a question which asks, how do you view the increase in switch from analyses of brain size to analyses of neuron counts? And once we have enough data, is brain size still worth studying?
It's a good question. I still think that brain size would still be worth studying. I think there was I seem to remember that there was a study that found that there was sort of a positive relationship between neuron counts and brain size, if I remember correctly. But of course, maybe neuron counts give you a more precise measure of the actual brain size, and there would be differences if there's differences in the density of the brains, then neuron count would give you a more precise estimate. But right now, really, what is much more broadly available is brain size. There's another discussion also as to whether, you know, we should focus more on specific areas of the brain rather than the brain as a whole. But I think that if you're looking at, you know, sort of broad outcome of, you know, increased brain size, which is due, you know, greater behavioral flexibility, but there are also effects. There are some studies that suggest there might be effects even on greater control of physiological functions through increased brain size and so on. Then I think that really involves all brain regions, because there's a lot of interconnection between the different regions. So even if you do have what they tend to call this sort of more processing center area of the brain, it doesn't mean that it's completely detached from the other regions. So I think in that sense, brain size does give a good proxy for, you know, incorporating all the different aspects of the benefits that the increased brain size can bring. Yeah.
I see, almost like a whole systems approach, which incorporates, I guess, any synergistic interactions between different components within the brain as a whole.
Yeah, and the interconnections that they have, you know, that we know that there are many links between different brain regions, and that information flows from one to the other one. So
interesting. So it's interesting how you look at, so you have obviously brain size and its interaction with body size, and then you see how they interact with other life history traits to ultimately influence the outcome. Within the life history traits, I guess this is almost related to pace of life theory to some extent, and maybe organisms which have like a faster life history or slower life history, this links in with what the ultimate outcome is in the interaction with brain size. Is that something you would agree with, the pace of life idea and the interaction with brain size?
Yeah, I would think so, because there's a nice work by Daniel Sol also showing that this sort of if we can call it speed of life history, tends to link very well with increased brain size. And you know, we do link sort of, we do a sort of, in the models we're testing sort of a new unidirectional connection between brain size and let's say, for example, maximum longevity, right? Well, life history and maximum longevity, I'm sorry. But I think that it's not exactly unidirectional. I think that there's sort of a feedback effect. So it's hard to know exactly where it starts, so the chicken and the egg thing. But for example, slow life histories both allow larger brains, you know, to enable larger brains by allowing, you know, the offspring to actually develop the larger brain. So allowing them longer periods to develop and to grow their brain and to actually learn many things that can be necessary for, and then give the benefit of that enlarged brain size by having the prolonged life history, right? So, but the brain at the same time allows the species to have, you know, to get the benefits of this larger brain size by by avoiding extrinsic mortality or all those benefits that come through the larger brain size. So I think it's really sort of a feedback loop where larger brains allow slower life histories through the benefits of behavioral flexibility, but also the slow life histories in turn allow the brain to grow more by delaying all this the development period, the age of first reproduction and so on.
Great, that's really interesting. So it's almost bi-directional. It's not necessarily the brain on the reproductive traits, but it could be in both directions.
I think so, yeah.
Great. Have you seen any scenarios where species over time have evolved a smaller brain rather than a larger brain? Are there species where that is the case?
Yeah, there was a very interesting paper by in bats by Safi and collaborators that looked at in certain bat species where actually selection had favored smaller brains. So actually where they seem to find evidence for a reduction in brain size. And I mean, for example, also migration is related to reduce brain size, probably due to the high energetic costs of migrating. So maybe that also, I don't know if it's, if it's related with a reduction in brain size or actually the brain size grows in species that don't migrate. But there are scenarios where a reduction in brain size can actually be beneficial.
That's very cool. Thank you. That's interesting. So I think that's actually all we have time for today. But it is our great pleasure to thank you once again for a truly fascinating talk.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I think this is one of the very positive things that have come out of this very complex situation that we're living in, that we have this wonderful seminar series that all of you are organizing. And it has open connections across the world, I think, for many researchers. So that I think it's been great. So thank you very much for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Alejandro. So just before we finish, I'd like to remind everyone watching that our next talk will take place on Wednesday next week, where we will be joined by Dr. Brandon Ogbunu from Yale University, with more details coming soon. So save the date, and we hope that you can join us then. And in the meantime, check out our updates on Twitter and Slack and spread the word about our seminars. Thanks for taking part, and until next time, stay safe and see you again soon. Goodbye.